There was a man who lost almost everything: his freedom, his family, his certainty about tomorrow. And yet, he discovered something that could not be taken away. Viktor Frankl lived through a place where human life was reduced to numbers, routines, and survival. And still he asked a question most people avoid. Why do some people collapse when life becomes unbearable while others grow quieter, but stronger? Why does suffering destroy certain lives, yet deepen others? Why does meaning matter more than comfort, especially when nothing feels fair? This video is not about inspiration. It is about the part of you that remains when nothing else does. Before moving forward, this is an invitation to slow down, not to listen for answers, but to listen for yourself. The words you are about to hear were not written to sound wise. They were shaped in moments when choices were few and clarity mattered more than hope. Each sentence is a quiet observation about how human beings respond when life refuses to change. We will move through these thoughts one by one, not as quotes to admire, but as mirrors to pause in front of. And it begins with a simple realization about what happens when change is no longer possible. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. At first, this sentence sounds almost too simple, but its weight comes from the moment it applies to when every obvious option has already failed. Most people spend their energy trying to change the situation. They wait for circumstances to improve. They hope someone else will act differently. They believe that once the outside changes, peace will follow. But this quote speaks to the moment after all of that collapses, when the situation does not move, when explanations no longer help, when effort does not lead to relief. Frankl is not suggesting self-blame. He is pointing to a shift of direction. There are moments in life where the external world becomes fixed. An illness that does not go away, a loss that cannot be undone, a reality that refuses to negotiate. In those moments, continuing to fight the situation often creates a second layer of suffering. Not because the pain increases, but because resistance never rests. What remains then is not control, but response. Changing oneself does not mean becoming someone else. It means adjusting the inner posture toward what already is. It is the difference between saying, "This should not be happening," and asking, "How will I stand inside this?" In everyday life, this appears in small, quiet ways. A job that drains but cannot yet be left. A relationship that ended without closure. A season of loneliness that explanations do not fix. Many people stay stuck because they keep waiting for permission to move on. They wait for circumstances to soften first. Frankl suggests the opposite. Movement begins inside. This is not about optimism. It is about dignity. To change oneself is to reclaim agency where none seems left, not by denying reality, but by choosing how deeply it defines you. This idea often feels uncomfortable because it removes excuses. It places the responsibility back into human hands, gently but firmly. Not responsibility for the situation, responsibility for the self within it. That is why this sentence lingers. It does not promise relief. It offers direction. When something in your life refuses to change, what part of you tightens first? Do you keep waiting for the situation to shift before allowing yourself to breathe? If nothing outside moved at all, what inner change would still be possible for you right now? Yet even this idea raises a deeper concern. If the world cannot be controlled and the self must adapt, what freedom truly remains? Changing oneself sounds possible in theory, but in moments of extreme pressure, it can feel as though everything has already been taken. And that leads to a quieter, more unsettling question. Is there anything left that cannot be stripped away by circumstance? Frankl believed there was. and he called it the last human freedom. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. This sentence does not raise its voice. It does not argue. It simply states something most people only realize when it is almost gone. Frankl is not speaking about freedom in the political sense, not the freedom to go where you want, say what you want, or shape the world around you. He is speaking about a quieter freedom, one that exists even when all others disappear. When circumstances tighten, people often feel completely trapped. They say, "I had no choice," or "there was nothing I could do." And in many situations, that is true, externally. But Frankl draws a line between what happens and how it is met. Attitude is not mood. It is not forced positivity. It is not pretending something hurts less than it does. Attitude is the inner stance a person takes toward reality. It is the space between being crushed by what happens and being shaped by it. In everyday life, this freedom shows up in subtle ways. A person who responds to disappointment with bitterness or with silence. Someone who carries pain as a weapon or as a boundary. Someone who allows suffering to harden them or to slow them down. No one chooses pain, but people do choose what pain becomes. This is uncomfortable because it means no one is entirely powerless. Even when control is gone, authorship remains. That does not mean every response is easy. Some days, choosing an attitude means choosing not to collapse completely. Other days, it simply means refusing to become cruel. Frankl's idea does not demand strength. It allows for fragility. Choosing an attitude might look like patience, or restraint, or dignity without witnesses. This freedom cannot be taken because it does not depend on permission. It exists internally, even when the outside world is hostile. That is why this sentence feels heavy. It reminds people that even in the worst moments, something is still being asked of them. Not heroism, just a choice. When things go wrong in your life, what attitude do you fall into without noticing? Do you respond from habit or from intention? If you cannot change what is happening, what attitude are you choosing to carry it with? But recognizing this freedom brings another challenge. If we are always choosing an attitude, then reactions are not automatic. They are decisions. And between what happens to us and how we respond, there must be a moment where that choice appears. A moment so small it often goes unnoticed. Frankl believed that moment existed. A quiet space where awareness begins, and it is inside that space that the next insight emerges. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. This sentence points to something most people never notice, because it happens too fast. A comment is made, a message arrives, a look is given, and the reaction follows almost immediately. Anger, withdrawal, defensiveness, silence. Frankl is not denying how fast emotions arise. He is naming a small gap that exists before emotion turns into action. That space is not dramatic. It does not feel like freedom at first. It often feels like discomfort. In that brief moment, the body reacts before the mind understands. The heart tightens. Thoughts rush in to explain or justify. Old patterns prepare to repeat themselves. Most people live as if that space does not exist. They say, "That's just how I am," or "I couldn't help it." And sometimes it truly feels that way. But Frankl suggests something quieter, that even when emotion arrives uninvited, response is not inevitable. The space may be only a breath long, but inside it lies awareness. Awareness does not erase pain. It slows it down. In everyday life, this shows up in familiar moments. When criticism triggers defensiveness, when disappointment turns into bitterness, when fear disguises itself as anger. The space is where you notice the urge, but do not obey it immediately, where you allow yourself to feel without letting feeling decide everything. This is not self-control in the rigid sense. It is self-relationship. To recognize the space is to recognize that you are not identical to your reactions. You are the one who witnesses them, and that realization changes everything slowly, not instantly. Most growth does not come from big decisions. It comes from these small pauses that interrupt old cycles. Frankl understood that freedom does not always look like action. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Sometimes it looks like waiting. The space is fragile. If ignored, it closes quickly. If respected, it grows. And within it, a different kind of life begins to take shape, one that is chosen, not automatic. When something triggers you, do you notice the moment before you react? What usually fills that space? Fear, habit, or awareness? If you allowed yourself one more breath before responding, what might change? Yet awareness alone is not enough. Noticing the space explains how we choose, but not why we endure. Because choice without direction eventually feels empty. Endurance without meaning becomes exhaustion. Frankl believed that what carries a person through suffering is not strength, but purpose, not comfort, but a reason. And that brings us to the question he returned to again and again. What makes life worth bearing even when it hurts? Those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. This is perhaps Viktor Frankl's most quoted sentence, and because of that, it is often misunderstood. It is not a call to endure endlessly. It is not a command to be strong at all costs. It is an observation about what quietly sustains a human being when strength runs out. Frankl is not saying that having a why removes pain. He is saying it changes the relationship to pain. When people suffer without meaning, every difficulty feels heavier than it already is. Time slows down. Small problems feel unbearable. Fatigue becomes emotional, not just physical. But when there is a reason, however small, suffering gains context. A why does not have to be grand. It does not have to be a life mission or a heroic goal. Often, it is simple: a person, a responsibility, a promise not yet fulfilled, a truth you refuse to betray. In everyday life, many people confuse motivation with meaning. Motivation rises and falls. Meaning stays quieter, but steadier. You can lose motivation and still keep meaning. You can feel exhausted and still know why you continue. This is why Frankl's insight feels grounding rather than uplifting. It does not rely on emotion, it relies on orientation. When the why is clear, the how becomes survivable. Not pleasant, not easy, but possible. Without a why, even comfort can feel empty. With a why, even difficulty can be endured with dignity. Frankl observed that people did not break because they suffered. They broke when suffering became pointless. Meaning does not erase pain. It gives pain a place, and that place changes how a person moves through time. This sentence invites an honest question, not what makes me happy, but what gives my life weight, even on difficult days. That shift from pleasure to purpose is subtle, but it is where endurance becomes human rather than mechanical. When life feels heavy, what are you living for, not just living through? If comfort disappeared, what reason would still keep you moving forward? Is your why something you feel pressured to have, or something quietly true? Still, meaning raises another concern. If purpose is what carries us, what happens when circumstances strip life of all comfort? Is suffering itself the problem, or is it the emptiness inside suffering that hurts most? Frankl believed the difference mattered deeply. He saw that pain alone does not destroy people, but pain without meaning often does, and that leads to a difficult, unsettling thought. Perhaps life becomes unbearable not because of what happens, but because of what is missing. Life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by lack of meaning. This sentence often creates resistance, because at first glance, it sounds unfair. People hear it and think of illness, loss, poverty, betrayal. They think of situations that feel genuinely unbearable, and they wonder how meaning could possibly outweigh that. Frankl is not denying the reality of pain. He is distinguishing between pain and despair. Pain hurts, despair empties. Circumstances can wound the body and exhaust the mind, but meaning, or the absence of it, decides whether suffering collapses inward or is held together. When life feels unbearable, it is often not because of what is happening, but because the experience feels pointless. When suffering has no context, no direction, no reason to be endured, it becomes overwhelming. This is why two people can face similar hardships and emerge differently. One becomes bitter and hollow. The other becomes quieter, slower, but intact. The difference is not character, it is meaning. In everyday life, this shows up clearly. A demanding job feels unbearable when it leads nowhere. Loneliness feels heavier when it feels endless. Sacrifice feels cruel when it feels unseen. But when hardship connects to something larger, a responsibility, a value, a commitment, the weight shifts. Not because the load is lighter, but because it is carried for something. Frankl's insight is uncomfortable because it removes the illusion that relief alone will save us. Even comfort can feel unbearable when it is empty. Meaning is not something added on top of life. It is the structure that holds experience together. Without it, even small difficulties feel like too much. With it, even large ones can be faced without losing oneself. This does not mean people should accept injustice or remain in harmful situations. It means that when suffering exists, meaning determines whether it destroys or transforms. This sentence lingers because it shifts the question. Not, how do I escape this? But what does this ask of me? That question does not promise ease. It offers coherence. And sometimes, coherence is what keeps a person from breaking. When something feels unbearable in your life, what part hurts most? The pain itself, or the sense that it leads nowhere? Have you ever noticed how meaning changes your ability to endure? If your current struggle had a purpose, how would it feel different? But meaning is not always gentle. Sometimes it demands more than comfort ever could. If life asks something of us, it may also require sacrifice. Not loudly, not heroically, but slowly, over time. Frankl understood that what gives light does not come without cost, that growth often involves pressure, heat, and endurance, and in one short sentence, he captured that truth with painful clarity. What is to give light must endure burning. This sentence is brief, almost fragile, and yet it carries a weight that unfolds slowly. Frankl is not romanticizing pain. He is describing a pattern that appears again and again in human life. Anything that truly gives light, understanding, compassion, integrity, wisdom is shaped under pressure. Burning here is not sudden tragedy. It is prolonged discomfort. The kind that does not announce itself as meaningful while it is happening. In everyday life, this looks ordinary, showing patience when exhaustion would be easier, holding on to values when compromise would be rewarded, staying gentle in a world that responds faster to hardness. Most people want the outcome without the cost. They admire calmness without noticing the years of restraint behind it. They admire depth without seeing the loneliness that formed it. Frankl suggests that light is not produced by comfort, it is produced by endurance with direction. Burning does not mean seeking suffering. It means accepting that growth often involves heat you did not choose and deciding not to waste it. In modern life, many people feel burned without understanding why. They feel tired, cynical, emotionally depleted. Not because they care too much, but because the burning feels meaningless. Suffering without meaning consumes. Suffering with meaning refines. This sentence does not glorify pain. It gives pain a role without giving it control. To endure burning is not to harden. It is to stay present without becoming bitter. To allow pressure to clarify rather than distort. That is what gives this line its quiet power. It does not promise relief. It promises transformation if meaning is present. Not all pain produces light. But when light does appear, it has usually passed through fire first, and that truth asks something uncomfortable. Not, how do I avoid discomfort? But, what am I allowing this discomfort to shape? Where in your life do you feel quietly burned without recognition? Do you see that experience as damage or as pressure shaping something deeper? If this season were forming something valuable in you, what might that be? After burning, many people ask the same question: when does it end? When does life finally give back? Frankl offered a different perspective. He believed life was not something to be questioned endlessly, but something that questions us in return. Not gently, not clearly, but persistently. And that idea leads to his final, most challenging insight. One that turns the search for meaning completely around. Ultimately, man should not ask what the meaning of life is, but rather must recognize that it is he who is asked. This sentence quietly overturns a question most people have been asking their entire lives. What is the meaning of life? It sounds deep. It sounds philosophical. But Frankl believed it was incomplete. He suggested that life is not a problem waiting to be solved. It is a question being asked again and again through circumstances, moments, and choices. Meaning, then, is not something discovered once and kept forever. It is something responded to. Life asks through responsibility, through relationships, through suffering, through moments where no option feels ideal, but a response is still required. This perspective changes the posture of a human being. Instead of standing outside life, demanding answers, one stands inside life, answering through action. Frankl observed that people often become paralyzed, searching for a universal meaning. They wait for clarity before acting. They wait for certainty before committing. But life does not wait. The question is not abstract, it is personal. And it changes over time. What life asks of a person at 20 is not the same as what it asks at 40. What it asks in moments of strength is different from what it asks in moments of loss. Meaning is not general. It is situational, and that is what makes it both difficult and humane. This sentence removes the pressure to find a perfect philosophy. It replaces it with attentiveness. What is required here? What is being asked now? Sometimes the answer is endurance. Sometimes it is honesty. Sometimes it is letting go. Sometimes it is staying. Frankl's insight is demanding, but it is also freeing. You do not have to understand your entire life. You only have to answer the question in front of you. And your answer is not spoken. It is lived every day through small decisions, through restraint or courage, through how you treat what you cannot escape. That is where meaning happens. Not in explanation, but in response. If life were asking you a question right now, what might it be? Are you waiting to understand everything before responding? What answer are you giving? Not in words, but in how you are living today. Taken together, Viktor Frankl's words do not form a motivational speech. They form a quiet map. a map for moments when life feels fixed, when circumstances do not respond, when strength feels inconsistent, when answers do not arrive on time. Across every thought, one idea repeats, softly, insistently. Human dignity does not come from control. It comes from response. When change is impossible, the self becomes the place where movement begins. When freedom disappears, attitude remains. When reactions feel automatic, a small space opens. When pain feels heavy, meaning gives it structure. When endurance burns, something deeper can still take shape. And when questions feel endless, life itself is quietly asking for an answer. Not a perfect one, not a heroic one, just an honest one. Frankl never suggested that suffering is good. He suggested that how we stand inside suffering matters. Meaning is not found by escaping life. It is shaped by meeting it, one moment at a time. This is why his words continue to resonate. They do not tell people what to believe. They ask people how they are living, and perhaps that is the most human idea of all, that life does not need to make sense all at once. It only asks us to respond, here, now, as we are. As this journey comes to a pause, there is no final lesson to remember, only a few questions worth carrying. Which of these thoughts stayed with you the longest? Which sentence made you slow down, even briefly? And what did it bring up about the way you are living right now? Perhaps you are in a season where nothing seems to change. Perhaps you are carrying something quietly, without clarity or recognition. Perhaps life feels as though it is asking something, but you are not sure how to answer yet. There is no correct response, only an honest one. If you feel comfortable, share in the comments. Which idea touched you most, and why? What question do you feel life is asking of you in this moment? This space is not for conclusions. It is for listening, to one another and to ourselves.